Rebecca Moore was glowing, 7 months pregnant with the child everyone called a miracle. Yet her husband, Pastor Elijah Moore, hadn't been able to father children for over 20 years. The town of Millstone celebrated the blessing, but Elijah knew something was terribly wrong. What began as silent doubt soon unraveled into a tangled web of deceit, stolen money, and a plan so calculated it nearly destroyed everything he had ever built. In the quiet town of Millstone, North Carolina, nothing ever really changed. Life moved slowly, predictably, like the steady ticking of the old church clock that stood in the center of Grace Hill Church. Pastor Elijah Moore had been the heartbeat of that church for over 15 years. He was the kind of man people turned to in crisis and celebrated with joy. With his gentle tone, unwavering patience, and strong sense of purpose, Elijah was more than a religious figure. He was a symbol of stability in a world that often felt uncertain. His wife, Rebecca, matched him in grace and reputation. Elegant, warm, and always present, she played the piano during hymns, taught Sunday school, and ran the women's ministry with the calm precision of someone who had been preparing for the role her whole life. To outsiders, Elijah and Rebecca were the definition of a perfect couple. They lived in a modest but well-kept house just down the street from the church. Their front porch had white rocking chairs, their lawn was always mowed, and their windows glowed with warm light in the evenings. They hosted church dinners, led holiday charity drives, and rarely, if ever, missed a Sunday service. But behind closed doors, there was one silent ache in their lives, a child they never had. For years, people in Millstone wondered why the pastor and his wife, so clearly devoted to each other, never started a family. Some speculated they had chosen ministry over parenthood. Others whispered about possible health issues, but out of respect for the couple's privacy, no one ever asked directly. The truth was known only to a few. Elijah had a medical condition diagnosed in his early 30s that rendered him sterile. It had been a painful realization for the couple, but one they accepted with grace. They poured their energy into their church, into each other, and into the community they considered their family. When, after nearly 2 decades of marriage, Rebecca Moore announced she was pregnant, the town erupted with disbelief and joy. Some called it a miracle. Others saw it as a sign of divine favor. The news spread quickly, faster than anything had in Millstone in years. During Sunday service, members wept openly at the announcement. Women gathered around Rebecca with tears in their eyes, touching her stomach as if holiness itself had taken root. No one wanted to question something that felt so good, so hopeful, but not everyone celebrated. Elijah stood at the pulpit, his face carefully composed, his hands folded tightly in front of him. Inside, his heart raced with confusion and dread. He knew what no one else did, that what had just been declared a miracle couldn't be possible. He hadn't told Rebecca about the diagnosis again in years. They had grieved it once, long ago, and never spoke of it again. But he had never been treated, never sought any reversal, and never changed his condition. He was, to his knowledge, still sterile. At first, he tried to convince himself that something had changed. Perhaps he had been misdiagnosed. Maybe it was one of those rare cases where biology defied science. He clung to the idea for days, even weeks, but doubt gnawed at him with every smile, every congratulation, every passing stranger calling him father-to-be. He stopped sleeping through the night. He stopped eating much. When he looked at Rebecca, glowing and happy in her second trimester, he felt something inside him shift, something like betrayal, but heavier. Still, he said nothing. Instead, Elijah began searching for answers on his own. He started subtly, looking for inconsistencies, checking dates, remembering times when Rebecca had been away. He replayed conversations in his mind, scanned her emails when she left her laptop open, listened closely when she talked on the phone. Nothing obvious stood out, but his gut told him something was wrong. And Elijah, a man who spent his life guiding others through the storms of life, suddenly found himself standing in the middle of one. With no compass and no shoreline in sight, Rebecca's pregnancy progressed, and the town embraced its favorite couple with more warmth than ever. Before, Elijah became more distant. He smiled less, avoided eye contact, and spent longer hours locked in his study. People assumed it was stress or excitement or both. No one suspected that the man they saw every Sunday morning, delivering sermons about trust and forgiveness, was quietly unraveling behind his collar. The seed of doubt had taken root, and soon it would grow into something no one in Millstone could have ever imagined. Elijah Moore had always believed that truth revealed itself in time. As a pastor, he often preached about patience, faith, and the quiet confidence that light would eventually expose what darkness tried to hide. But as he watched his wife move through their home with a soft smile and a hand resting on her growing belly, he began to feel that time was not his ally. Rebecca looked happier than she had in years, glowing with the kind of joy that seemed unshakable. But for Elijah, each day chipped away at the life he thought he understood that he couldn't sleep. Night after night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle hum of the ceiling fan and the rhythmic sound of Rebecca's breathing. His thoughts circled like vultures. How had this happened? Who else knew? Was there someone in town laughing behind his back? Someone who knew the truth he feared? He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. He tried to write sermons, but they sounded forced. His connection to the pulpit was beginning to fray, one silent doubt at a time. The first real break came when Elijah checked Rebecca's calendar. She'd left her phone charging in the kitchen while she gardened out back. He hadn't planned to look, but something compelled him to open the digital planner she used to organize her week. One recurring event stood out. On the first Thursday of every month, she had marked an entry titled Support Meeting, Grief Group. She had never mentioned a grief group. Elijah thought he would have remembered that. After all, they were each other's closest confidants. Curiosity turned to suspicion. The next Thursday, instead of attending a church board meeting as planned, Elijah drove across town and parked near the address Rebecca had listed for her meeting. He waited inside his car, hoping to prove himself paranoid. But after an hour, he didn't see her. No sign of Rebecca entering the building. No familiar car in the parking lot. She wasn't there. Elijah drove home with a hollow feeling in his chest. Over the next few weeks, Elijah began to track her movements. He felt a deep sense of shame doing it, but something inside him wouldn't let go. He watched where she went after errands, when she left early for appointments, and when she claimed to be meeting friends for lunch. Most of the time, she stuck to the expected routine: groceries, volunteer work, church planning. But twice, Elijah followed her to a part of town he didn't recognize. Once, she pulled into a private parking garage and stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. The other time, she visited a quiet office park with tinted windows and no obvious signage. Elijah couldn't confront her. Not yet. He needed something concrete. He made the decision to hire a private investigator. The man was discreet, professional, and promised confidentiality. Within a week, he returned with photographs: Rebecca entering a fertility clinic under the name Rachel Moore. Elijah stared at the images in silence. In one, she stood beside a man in a white coat, smiling, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In another, the same man leaned in, close, too close. It was clear they knew each other well. The man was identified as Dr. Miles Harding, a reproductive specialist known in the area. A quick online search revealed a few professional articles, glowing patient reviews, and one photo from a medical conference. There was no obvious scandal, no record of misconduct. But the familiarity between Rebecca and Dr. Harding spoke volumes. Elijah now understood that his wife had not only lied about where she was going, she had gone behind his back in the most personal way imaginable. But still, questions remained. Was the child his? Could she have undergone some procedure that allowed for conception? Had she used donor sperm? Elijah didn't want to believe she had been unfaithful, but the evidence was mounting. And every answer he uncovered only seemed to lead to more painful questions. He began to isolate himself further, not just from Rebecca, but from the congregation. He shortened sermons, declined dinner invitations, and stopped attending committee meetings. Those closest to him began to whisper concerns about his health, about burnout. No one suspected the truth, that Elijah Moore, the calm and collected shepherd of Grace Hill Church, was spiraling. His foundation, his marriage, his faith, his understanding of love and loyalty, was beginning to crumble beneath him as he stood at the edge of what felt like a growing abyss. One thought haunted him more than any other. If Rebecca had gone this far to hide something, what else had she buried? And how long had she been building this world he knew nothing about? The baby arrived on a cool October morning. while the trees outside the hospital window shimmered in shades of gold and crimson. It should have been the happiest moment of Elijah Moore's life. Instead, he felt like a spectator watching someone else's story unfold. He held the child, tiny, soft, and perfect, yet something in his hands felt foreign, disconnected. The nurses congratulated him. Rebecca beamed. Photos were taken, texts were sent, and soon the church community flooded the hospital with flowers and homemade casseroles. Everyone celebrated the miracle child born to the pastor and his wife after nearly 20 years of waiting. But behind Elijah's tired eyes was a storm no one could see. 2 weeks earlier, he had mailed off a DNA sample. A single strand of hair from the baby's blanket and his own saliva swab were sent to a discreet lab out of state. The envelope felt heavy in his hands, like a secret screaming to be revealed. He didn't tell Rebecca. He didn't tell anyone. All he could do was wait and act as though everything in their world hadn't been turned upside down. When the envelope arrived, Elijah opened it alone in his study. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. It was a short report, cold and clinical in tone, but its message was clear: 0% probability of paternity. He stared at the number, willing it to change. But it didn't. The baby he had just brought home from the hospital was not his. Biologically, genetically, medically, there was no connection. Elijah sat motionless for over an hour, the letter crumpled in his hand. His entire life had been built on trust, on the idea that love was sacred and enduring. That belief had carried him through decades of ministry, through hardship, through the quiet sorrow of infertility. And now, with one sentence on a lab report, everything he had placed his faith in cracked open. But it wasn't just the confirmation of betrayal that disturbed him. It was the next question, the one that clawed at his mind like a shadow. If he wasn't the father, then who was? Elijah remembered the name from the investigator's earlier report, Dr. Miles Harding. He thought about the smiles exchanged outside the clinic, the familiarity, the quiet intimacy. Could it have been him? Could Rebecca's child belong to the man she visited under a false name? Elijah dug deeper. The investigator was hired again, this time with more specific instructions. Within days, he came back with something unexpected. The father was not Dr. Harding. A database search and quiet background inquiry revealed something far more alarming. DNA records from premarital counseling forms kept on file by the church matched the child's genetic markers. Not perfectly, but enough to point to a likely biological connection. The match wasn't to a doctor or a stranger. It was to Luke Jennings. Luke was a 26-year-old member of the congregation, a quiet, well-liked young man who volunteered regularly. He had helped organize youth retreats, stack chairs after services, and lead worship nights. He was often seen lending a hand, sometimes to Rebecca. Elijah could now remember moments he had dismissed. Luke offering to walk her to the car, carrying church supplies to her trunk, staying after Bible study to help clean up. All those seemingly innocent acts now burned in his memory. But this wasn't just about an affair. It felt calculated, deliberate. Why him? Why now? Elijah reviewed church logs, video surveillance from the building, event schedules, anything that might give him a fuller picture. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Luke had grown closer to Rebecca over the past year. The church had no reason to question it. After all, Luke was known for being responsible and deeply committed to the faith. But Elijah now saw a different timeline. A carefully orchestrated one. Had this been love? Manipulation? A plot? He considered confronting them. But the idea of storming in with accusations seemed too raw, too early. Elijah had always relied on facts before reaction, and this was no different. He needed more. Proof beyond the genetic. Something that would explain why he kept his distance from Luke, avoiding eye contact during services, brushing off small talk. With Rebecca, he maintained the performance. He held the baby in front of the congregation. He thanked well-wishers. He even stood before his church and gave a sermon about gratitude and grace. But beneath his words was a man hollowed out. He looked at his son, not his son, and wondered what kind of world he had stepped into. One where nothing was as it seemed, and everyone wore masks. Elijah had spent his life believing in miracles. Now, he understood that some miracles were just very well-disguised lies. The town of Millstone was still basking in the glow of the pastor's unexpected fatherhood. Church attendance was up. Donations flowed freely. There was talk of expanding the children's wing. People said it was a sign that God's blessings had returned to Grace Hill Church in the form of a newborn child. Pastor Elijah Moore's name was spoken with reverence, and Rebecca was admired with a kind of awe. No one could have guessed that. Behind the stained glass and warm sermons, Elijah was following a paper trail that led further away from God and closer to something much darker. He had told no one about the DNA results. The knowledge festered in him like a slow infection. Each smile from Rebecca, each visit from a well-meaning parishioner, only deepened his silence. But Elijah knew one thing. A betrayal like this didn't happen in isolation. If Rebecca had deceived him about the child's father, what else had she hidden? The answer came quietly and without warning. While reviewing old church budgets in preparation for the upcoming annual meeting, Elijah noticed a few inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, just small discrepancies that didn't add up. Donations were accounted for, but certain expenses seemed vague. A check for $3,200 labeled Community Outreach Event had no event tied to it. A $1,100 reimbursement listed under Guest Speaker Travel didn't match any dates on the calendar. At first, Elijah assumed it was clerical error. But when he pulled financial statements from the last 18 months, the irregularities piled up. It wasn't just one or two mistakes. It was a pattern, repeated, deliberate, and concealed under layers of vague descriptions. Someone had been funneling money. He turned to the bank records next. Grace Hill Church had one primary account for donations and expenses, but there was another name listed under linked accounts. More Ministries. Elijah froze. He had never created such an entity. The church board had never approved it. Yet here it was, quietly receiving small transfers every few weeks, totaling over $48,000 across the last year and a half. He accessed the activity and found what he had feared. Luxury items, Airbnb rentals in cities miles away, a $4,000 furniture, purchase from a boutique store in Atlanta, payments to a photography studio, and finally, an airline ticket purchased in someone else's name, but using the same account. Luke Jennings. Elijah sat at his desk in disbelief. The pieces were starting to connect, but the picture they painted was almost too surreal to accept. Rebecca and Luke had not only engaged in an affair, they had used church funds to bankroll their relationship. Trips, private rentals, gifts, all paid for with donations from widows, veterans, young families. Money that was meant to serve others had been funneled into a secret second life. He gathered every document, every statement, every receipt, and stored them on a flash drive. Then, quietly and without fanfare, Elijah drove to the Millstone Police Department. He handed over the evidence to a detective and gave a simple statement. He didn't mention the baby. He didn't mention his suspicions of paternity. He let the documents speak for themselves. An investigation was launched quietly to avoid disrupting the church. Officers traced the transactions, matched signatures, and confirmed that both Rebecca and Luke had full access to the More Ministries account. Rebecca had filed the paperwork to create it using her maiden name and an out-of-town P.O. box. The airline ticket? Scheduled for next month. Destination? Belize. Detectives discovered she had purchased land there, a small coastal property under a shell corporation. Luke, meanwhile, had applied for a passport under a slightly altered name, using a falsified birth certificate. The plan had been in motion for months. Their child, the money, the carefully constructed public image, it had all been part of a long con. And they were weeks away from vanishing for good. But now, the police were watching. A quiet arrest plan was formed, one that wouldn't cause panic or rumors. Elijah, broken and exhausted, kept preaching each Sunday as though nothing had changed. He delivered sermons about forgiveness, even as the weight of betrayal threatened to crush him. But he stood beside Rebecca on Sunday mornings, smiled when the baby cooed, thanked members for their prayers and love, all while waiting for the moment when the truth would come crashing down. What haunted him most was not the affair or even the theft. It was that Rebecca had looked him in the eye every day, held his hand, and whispered, "I love you," knowing she was already building a life without him. A life she had nearly gotten away with. Elijah didn't know what would happen next. But he knew this. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It was coming. And when it arrived, it would leave Millstone changed forever. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning just before sunrise. It happened quietly, without sirens or spectacle. Two unmarked cars pulled into the church parking lot, and another waited outside the Moore's home. Rebecca was getting ready for a women's prayer breakfast when the knock came. Luke was inside, the church sanctuary preparing for youth worship. They were both led away in handcuffs, not even allowed to speak to each other. By the time the sun had fully risen over Millstone, the whispers had started. Word spread fast. The perfect image of the pastor's family cracked like thin glass. Congregants who had wept at Rebecca's pregnancy now sat in stunned silence. Church staff reviewed the bank documents investigators provided and confirmed what Elijah had uncovered. Donations meant for local shelters and food drives had been rerouted, laundered, and used for personal gain. A year's worth of good deeds undone by two people who had pretended to be faithful. It wasn't just betrayal. It was fraud, and it was deeply personal for those who had trusted them. Elijah remained silent through the chaos. He did not speak to the media. He offered no public statements. He attended court hearings in a plain suit and stood in the back, unnoticed by most. People wanted to hear from him, wanted his side, his pain, his version of the story. But Elijah gave nothing. It wasn't pride or fear that kept him quiet. It was exhaustion. The truth had already spoken louder than he ever could at in court. Prosecutors painted a picture of methodical deception. Rebecca had planned it all: the financial cover-ups, the creation of a false ministry, and the romantic manipulation of a young man who had been looking for purpose. Luke Jennings, as the court revealed, had fallen deeply under her influence. Text messages and emails detailed a complex emotional relationship, with Rebecca positioning herself as a mentor, a spiritual confidant, and eventually a partner. She had convinced him they were meant to be, that Elijah would understand, that the baby was their chance at a new beginning. What emerged during testimony stunned even Elijah. Rebecca claimed that Elijah had known about the affair for months before the baby's birth. According to her, he had chosen to keep quiet, not out of ignorance, but out of fear of losing his reputation. She told the court he had suggested keeping up appearances until the time was right. The courtroom buzzed. Reporters scrambled to quote her. The public didn't know what to believe. Elijah sat still, eyes fixed forward. The accusation wounded him in a way the affair never could. He had tried to protect the church, his community, his image, but not at the cost of truth. That had always mattered to him. But now even his silence was being weaponized. He couldn't defend himself without sinking deeper into the mess. So, he said nothing. In the end, Rebecca Moore was found guilty of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 5. Luke Jennings received a reduced sentence, 5 years, due to what the court called significant emotional manipulation. His statements during the trial, filled with confusion and regret, painted a picture of someone swept up in something far more complex than he could handle. The money was gone. The baby, placed in foster care, awaited a decision from family court. The church attempted to recover. Some members left, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal. Others stayed, forming prayer circles for healing, and meeting weekly to rebuild the fractured trust. Grace Hill Church would survive, but it would never be the same. Elijah formally resigned. He didn't announce it from the pulpit. Instead, he submitted a quiet letter to the board and left town within days. No one knew exactly where he went. Some said he moved north to be closer to his sister. Others believed he went into retreat, taking time to reflect and recover. His house was sold, his name removed from the church signage. He became a memory, not a scandal, a ghost in the town's recent history. Years later, people still talked about what happened. They spoke of Rebecca's fall from grace, Luke's naivety, and the child who had become a symbol of everything lost. But mostly, they spoke of Elijah Moore, not with judgment, but with the haunted reverence people give to those who carry pain silently. Some believed he was a victim. Others believed he knew more than he let on. But no one could deny the tragedy of what had unfolded. A pastor's wife, pregnant with a child that wasn't his. A church built on trust, shaken to its foundation. And a man who, despite everything, chose to walk away rather than burn the whole house down. In the end, the truth came not as a scream, but as a whisper. And for Elijah, that was loud enough.